email address of the person who created the account in the first instance. And that user is kind of God knows the root to the admin. It can do absolutely everything. So it represents a security risk. The root user could delete the account. So what you need to do, and what we recommend, is that the root account is locked down and only used when necessary. So there's a small subset of activities that only the root user can do. They're not day-to-day activities. So they're things like changing the support plan, for instance, which is a one-off activity. So there's a couple of one-off things the root user can do. So what you need to do for every single account, make sure the root user has a very strong password, MFA is enabled, that MFA token is locked away. So literally, in certain circumstances, we've got customers who use MFA tokens and they're locked in a safe, and the safe can only be accessed by two people. So you actually have a separation of responsibility. So you need both of those people to come together to get access to the MFA token so that it can be used. I think we've got some customers who use soft tokens on mobile phones. Those mobile phones are in safes with a power supply wired into the safe so that the mobile phones can be maintained, their power can be maintained so they don't completely die and lose the token. So it's a very important point around locking the root account. It's one of the most important things you need to do. Next, you should be enabling things like AWS config and guard duty. CloudTrail is enabled by default. So that is a audit log of actions taken by all the users and roles and services within the account. So it provides an audit trail of who's doing what. AWS config continuously monitors and records the configuration of all the resources within the accounts. And then it enables you to track over time any changes that are being made, and it also now enables you to compare the configuration of your resources to certain compliance standards. And you can see you get a gap, kind of a report to show you where you're lacking against certain compliance standards. And Guard Duty is a threat detection service that analyzes CloudTrail, S3, VPC flow logs, and DNS logs, and looks to identify malicious activity or potentially malicious activity. So those things should be on to give you that kind of baseline security. You obviously need to define, as I said, your users and roles. So, and this leads into the federation point. So if you're dealing with a large business, existing business, they will probably have, they often do have, when we talk about enterprises, they've got an existing identity source, identity provider, something like Active Directory or Okta. It's best practice to federate users from that service into AWS so that the existing kind of joiners, movers, leavers process, which defines where employees, what groups they're assigned to and what permissions they should ultimately be able to assume within AWS. That'll all get managed in that source of truth, in that user directory, and then they'll be able to assume roles to get access, appropriate access within AWS, within their accounts. There should be cross-account roles established, and I'll talk about that a bit more later, but essentially for security personnel, they should be able to have the option of the ability to assume roles to get access to accounts which contain workloads so they can take action in the event of security incidents, for example. And you need to be able to define the boundaries to be applied to these accounts to control users' activities. So, control what actions and conditions to enforce in line with your governance requirements or company's governance requirements. So, talked a bit about accounts and why businesses may consider using a multi-account architecture, and some of this is kind of basic security considerations. So then the next question becomes, how do you best go about organizing the accounts, and what mechanisms can you put in place to get the right levels of governance to protect the organization? And as I said, the goal is that we want to be flexible and agile, but at the same time ensure that risks are mitigated and that we're able to put guardrails in place and have the right logging and monitoring and security services in place. So we need to think about how to apply this in a scalable manner, in an automated manner. And the way in which we can go about managing this complexity is with AWS organizations. Now this is a management service that enables you to consolidate multiple accounts into a structure that you define and then centrally manage. So as you can see in the diagram on this slide, what you're able to do is define a structure using organizational units or OUs, and then you assign accounts or put accounts inside an OU, and it's a logical structure, and then you can apply security policies to organizational units, and those policies will then get applied to those accounts that sit within those OUs. So it's a way of providing some kind of structure to the policies and the governance that you want to wrap around the environment. So these security service control policies, these guardrails that we want to apply, look a little bit like this. So this is an example. Got a couple of examples just to go through, just to show you. They look like IAM documents, if you're familiar with the IAM service. So similar to the policies, the permissions that you apply to IAM users and roles, you can apply a similar policy to an SCP and apply that to an OU, and that gets applied to the entire account. So it gives you control over the maximum available permissions that are applied to the account. So in this example, you want to stop, and this is a best practice, by the way, so you want to stop CloudTrail from being disabled. So as I mentioned earlier, CloudTrail is that log of activity, user and service activity within your accounts. So CloudTrail should always be on. Now, in order to prevent anybody from disabling CloudTrail, you can create this very simple looking SCP, which has got a deny effect on the specific action CloudTrail stop logging. You apply that to an OU, and that takes effect on every user that exists within the account that's being applied to. So nobody within that account can then turn off CloudTrail, turn off logging. So it's a way of providing those. That's a preventative guardrail. And I should say, so in terms of that diagram, that's just demonstrating the fact that you'll have multiple accounts, and we'll talk about this concept in a bit more detail. But the idea will be to have CloudTrail logging to a central location. So you want to make sure that no one in a kind of member account, as we call them, as the terms, no one in a member account should be able to turn off CloudTrail, and CloudTrail should be configured to send all of those logs to a centralized log archive account, which can then be inspected by auditors or the security team for whatever reason, if they need to review logs and review activity across the entire organization. So across this could be many hundreds of accounts. So this is another example of a SCP, and this just prevents CloudWatch from being disabled, or for CloudWatch metric alarms or dashboards being adjusted. So you can see here, we can go quite granular. So every API action can be explicitly called out within a policy, and you can deny, prevent people from doing that particular action within the accounts. So CloudWatch has got many more API actions that you could call out here, but these are just some specific ones that you may want to disable within an organization. And we've also got a slightly more complicated example. So this one restricts certain actions from outside specific regions. So we have the effect on the left-hand side there is deny. So this is a SCP that's denying some action, but it does not deny IAM actions, organizations, Route 53 support, budgets, or CloudFront actions. So the reason being, if you look on the right-hand side, we're saying that if a request has come through, and if the request is targeting any region that is not EU Central or EU West, then we don't want to allow any of those, any actions that are not listed on the left to happen. So this is basically saying people can only do things in EU Central and EU West. So if anyone tries to deploy an EC2 instance, a virtual machine, or do anything, deploy the network, or spin up, deploy a Lambda function, do anything outside of those two regions, it won't happen. The reason that we've got those services on the left included here under the not action is because some of these services are global and they actually have an endpoint elsewhere. So the endpoint for IAM, for example, is US East 1. So if we didn't have IAM listed there under not action, your IAM, you wouldn't be able to interact with IAM because IAM does not exist in those two regions. So when you try to make those calls, you're basically locking yourself out of doing any IAM activities. So you can get quite creative with those SCPs that you apply. Now, in terms of how organizations is set up, what you first do is you choose an account that's going to be the management account for organizations. And within there, you set up organizations. It's in a console. You go through a process of setting it up. And once you've done that, you can invite other accounts into the organization. You can remove accounts. It's where your SCPs live. So you can apply the policies, you can create your organizational unit hierarchy, you can assign accounts to OUs, you can assign SCPs to those OUs. And it has the responsibilities of a payer account. So it's responsible for paying up all of the charges for all of the member accounts. As they say, get kind of consolidated billing on one bill. So a large organization that has many accounts can use organizations and get sent one bill at the end of the month. So I'm going to go through and build this view up of a kind of reference architecture that's become the baseline standard for how our customers adopt the best practices that we've learned over time. So not every customer ends up with this precise model. There's always some deviation, but broadly speaking, this framework holds true for most customers. Most customers follow this, generally speaking. So we start off with this organizational master account at the top. So this is that organization's admin account where you're inviting accounts, you're doing your OU structure, you create your SCPs. So if we imagine a scenario where we have an existing enterprise or an existing business that's got some on-prem, got a data center, got some services running on-prem, the organizational master account would not have a connection to that data center, wouldn't be needed. It's where we create those SCPs. It's where consolidated billing happens and where you can view that bill. And then customers can start thinking about things like volume discounts. Minimal, if any, resources would be deployed in the organization master. And because it is a privileged account, because you're doing things like creating SCPs, those service control policies in that account, it should be restricted. There should be very limited access. You don't want anyone going in there and start messing around with those SCPs because that will introduce a security risk. So next up are core accounts. So these are a set of foundational building blocks which are deployed once per organization. So these are the kind of central accounts that provide some unique function, critical function for the rest of the business to kind of operate within this framework. And we'll run through what each of those is. So the first one, and certainly, well, I mean, they're all pretty important, but this is a very, very important account that I've mentioned earlier, is the log archive account. So that works as a repository for logs of API activities and resource configuration changes from all of the accounts in the environment. So essentially, it contains a versioned or an S3 bucket with versioning enabled that's restricted, locked down. So it's got restricted MFA delete enabled. So you can only delete items within that bucket if the MFA is enabled, but even if things are deleted, they're versioned. So that shouldn't be possible. So it's completely locked down. There's very few so it stores all of the CloudTrail logs, as I mentioned earlier, from all of these member accounts. They get sent through to this log archive account. It's securely stored here. It's also where security logs would be sent. So it's that centralized repository of all the logs, which acts as a single source of truth over time, so you can trawl through these logs and see a history of what's going on, what's happened, who you bought over time within the environment. And you should have alarms configured that would trigger on a user login. So ideally, no one should be logging into this account. Ideally, you would have, and what you should have are roles that users, but preferably other services, can assume to get read-only access into the log archive account. So what you would probably do is have some kind of tooling elsewhere with some log aggregation software, for example, which has a read-only access to that log archive account, which so it can then read those logs, and users from the business can then view the log data without actually having to touch the log archive account. So what you're doing is mitigating risk, reducing the possibility that someone goes in there and starts deleting files and editing logs. So obviously you don't want that. You need that to be a accurate history of what's happening. Next up, related, is the security account. So, and you'll see this is a recurring thing. The security account will have CloudTrail enabled, and it will be sending logs to the log archive account. There would be an optional connection to on-prem DC data center, and that would depend really whether or not you had security tooling existing in that data center that needs connectivity to AWS. That's why it's optional. Some customers have that, some don't. It is the way you'd have security tools, the kind of audit tools. I'm going to talk about this in a bit, but it would be your guard duty and security hub master account. So as I mentioned earlier, we want to have a central view of security incidents. So we need data flowing from all of the accounts in the environment to that centralized security account. And with AWS services such as Guard Duty and Security Hub, you can delegate an admin account for those, a master account for those two services, and they will consolidate all of that data. So your security team only need access to a security account. From there, they get visibility of all of the security data and information that's flowing in. So I'm going to talk about that a little bit more in a moment. There would also be these cross-account roles that I mentioned, which would probably be focused around read-only access initially, probably for automated tooling. So if you had some security tooling within the security account, which that may need the ability to assume roles into other accounts to do scanning, or also roles should be defined for InfoSec personnel to be able to log into other accounts and event a security incident. And again, this should have very limited access. So this will be managed by the security function. So there'd be the only people who should have access to that account. So as I've alluded to a couple of times, one of the important decisions that you need to make when deploying multiple accounts is how you assure certain levels of security. So you need to think about how you're going to roll out and configure security services, and how you go about collecting and actioning all the logs. So you can end up with a huge amount of logs and signals from all of these accounts and workloads that have been deployed. So you don't want to have a situation where you have lots of pools of data across the organization. You need to consolidate that. So the answer is you centralize the management and collection of that data into a single security account, with certain services like Guard Duty and Security Hub, which allow you to do that quite easily. And that's not an exhaustive list. So in terms of member accounts, I've also mentioned a MACI, which is a service that identifies potentially sensitive information that's stored on S3. So you get reports if you've got an S3 bucket that's public, that's got some PII data in it. MACI will help you deal and manage with that. And I've mentioned config, which is that kind of resource configuration history that's recorded over time, but there's other services that we have as well. So in terms of what this specifically, how Security Hub works, that service is a security management service that performs best practice security checks and aggregates alerts and enables some remediation, automated remediation. So the way in which it does that is kind of focal point for logs and findings from all of the services, AWS security services and some partner solutions, send signals through to Security Hub. And then it allows you to correlate findings so that you can carry out investigations if there has been an incident, or you can trigger additional actions. So you could have, alerts or notifications that are being triggered based on certain things that have happened, or you can fire Lambda functions to automate some remediation. So you may have a rule, you may write some automation such that if XYZ happens, trigger this Lambda function to isolate an EC2 instance by removing a security group or isolating it within the network. So it enables you to do that as well. So obviously, as I mentioned, so Security Hub would be centralized. Guard Duty would also be centralized as well, pulling in all of this data from all of the accounts across the environment. So moving on, we've got shared services account, which would also be deployed in these core accounts area. So again, logging to the log archive, it would most likely be connected to the on-prem data center so that it could connect to on-prem user directories like Active Directory. May also need to connect to things like DNS on-prem. So what we might do is extend AD into the shared services, run Active Directory on some EC2 instances in the shared services account, so that you're not relying on the AD servers running on the data center, because if that network link went down, you don't want a situation where you can't, authenticate, or applications that rely on AD can't function. You may also have some shared tooling, deployment tools, which are creating things like golden EC2 images in the shared services account. It's basically any services that are going to be consumed by the majority of the workload accounts will sit within shared services. That can really vary. Might also include things like scanning infrastructure. So you may have some kind of operational activities looking at inactive instances or improperly tagged resources or operating system patch levels in there. You may also have some monitoring tooling in there. And again, this would have limited access, so it'd be owned by the team that operates all of those functions. Then we've got the last core account is the networking account, which logs to the log archive and wouldn't be necessarily connected to anything else. It'd be managed by the network team. It would be used to manage networking services. So you may have things like Direct Connect, firewalls, NAT gateways, proxies managed from the networking account, but you wouldn't necessarily have much networking in the way of VPCs and services deployed actually within the networking account, because what happens is VPCs and networks would be deployed in the workload accounts that I'm going to get to, where all of the applications actually sit, if you're running things on EC2 instances. And if you're using fully serverless, you obviously don't need networks necessarily. Now, so what the networking account would allow the networking team to do is manage those and configure those services from the networking account. So you'd have some cross-account roles and things like that, so the network team could access those member accounts. And again, limited access, because you only want the networking team to be able to interfere and manage with those networking services. Next up would be developer accounts, and these are developer sandbox accounts. So there would be no connection to on-prem data center. It's basically an innovation space for the developers to test new ideas, a bit of a playground. In order to mitigate the risk of spending too much money, you'd have fixed spending limits on here, but within those limits, they would be autonomously managed by developers, and they're basically just an experimentation place for individual developers just to play around, get used to services, test out some ideas. Then we have team or group accounts. So this is where applications will actually be deployed. So the number of accounts would depend on the organization's requirements around level of isolation. So that may depend on security or their own compliance requirements. They would typically match the level, the stage of the software development lifecycle. So for instance, to start with, you may have a developer account. This differs from the developer sandbox, as this is a collaboration space where development teams get together to actually start developing applications that are going to be rolled out and pushed eventually to production. It's the initial stage of the software development lifecycle, and the idea is once the development's been completed, the applications will be pushed to the next stage. So we've got pre-production here. There are some customers who have, many different stages, many more in between. So you may have, testing, QA, staging environments, more by which are kind of bundling all those into pre-production. So there may be several different kinds of pre-production. This step may be kind of separated out to a greater degree. But again, pre-production sends logs to the log archive. It will be connected to shared services to get access to those services that are required. So things potentially like DNS or Active Directory from on-prem if that's required. Those patching services that we mentioned would be connected to the data center if required. And it's production-like, so it needs to have more security controls applied at this point. It's where applications are staged before being tested, before being deployed to production. And at this point, the customers really need to be doing automated deployment at this phase to mimic those that will be used to promote the applications directly into production. So, which is the next type of account. So production will be, again, probably connected to the on-prem data center, connected to shared services, where the production applications live. So it's a lockdown environment. Those applications are promoted from pre-production. There'll be very, very limited restricted access at this point. You don't want developers accessing or anybody accessing production. You don't want to inadvertently cause some issue that takes applications down offline. And everything should be done through those automated deployments. So tooling should be used to do these deployments. There shouldn't be any kind of manual hand-run scripts or anything like that, or any developers logging in to the production environment to do anything. Everything should be tools-driven, automated to reduce risk. And then I think the final type of account is the team shared services account. So as things develop and as the maturity of the organization kind of develops, or the customer develops, typically what they'll find is certain teams. So let's say you may have a team that looks after manufacturing, and they've decided that they are doing some work that requires very specific services for their application. You'd have an individual team's shared services account for that group. So this is where you would deploy shared services that don't fit into the common shared services account. So it's more specific, shared to that team. The product-specific common services. So an example might be a data lake. So if you've got a particular group with an application that's generating a lot of data, they may want to deploy their own data lake in their own account that they can then leverage for analytics and machine learning. Right, so now we've been through that. So we've got this, we've built that up, and we've got to the point where we have a relatively kind of complex, sophisticated structure of accounts that are fulfilling their specific purposes. And we actually have a name for this. So within AWS, we call this a landing zone. And it can be quite time consuming to set up this overall structure and get the baseline security up and running. So we've actually developed a service that provides an easy to deploy automated approach, which uses best practices to provide security and a governance baseline from which customers can then develop and fine tune as they need to. So that's called Control Tower. So Control Tower provides an easy way to get this environment, this kind of our environment set up, this multi-account environment set up. It automates the setup of landing zones using best practice blueprints. So one of the things it does is it helps to create a multi-account environment using AWS organizations. So organizations and Control Tower really go hand in hand. It sets up AWS single sign-on. So in terms of if you have an existing identity source as a customer, if you have something like Active Directory or Okta, You can federate those users into AWS with AWS SSO to enable single sign-on, so users don't have to sign into AWS in a painstaking way. It sets up an account vending machine, or what we call an account factory, so this enables the whole self-service side of things, which is a really nice feature. So what you can do is you can actually predefine what policies and what kind of baseline network architecture accounts should be vended with, and you can give users within the business the ability to go to the account factory and self-provision their own accounts. And those accounts will have a baseline configuration, some guardrails in place, some default networking in place to help speed up their kind of adoption. So that enables the whole self-service side of things. It also will create and configure several organizational units. It will create the log archive account. It will create the centralized CloudTrail and AWS config setup. It will create the security or audit account with cross-account roles and some notifications and an account baseline. And it will also, through the account factory process, allow people to create these provisioned accounts, these memory accounts, which have that security account baseline and also a network baseline that's predefined. So the landing zone that ultimately completely gets set up is managed using a set of, so there's some mandatory and some recommended, strongly recommended guardrails, which customers can select through the console. So they can ensure that all of their accounts can comply with their own kind of governance, security, and compliance policies. So wrapping things up and putting it all together, we've talked about what the landing zone is, what it looks like, and how you can kind of deploy one. The next step for customers is then to think about the account metadata and who will own the accounts, what stage of the software development lifecycle they're going to apply to, which business unit they're going to belong to, how to define and apply cost centers, thinking about how to do chargeback and all the billing side of things. They also need to think about what policies get applied. And the policies are those guardrails, those SCPs that need to be applied. So as I mentioned, Control Tower has some mandatory and some strongly recommended SCPs, but customers will want to create their own custom ones to help adhere to their own compliance requirements. Those policies might be things like we need to enforce and make sure that all EBS volumes for our EC2 instances are encrypted. We may want to enforce policies that apply to certain workloads, that no internet gateway is assigned to certain networks, meaning that certain servers can't access the internet directly. There may be rules where you want to enforce a certain tagging policy. So you need to think about policy creation and deployment, the enforcement of those policies. Are they going to be preventative and therefore kind of mandatory, or are they going to be detective and you're going to do some remediation off the back of it? How's that remediation process going to go? And then you also need to think about the notifications. So throughout all of this kind of the entire environment, you're going to have notifications coming through for SCP violations, data coming through potentially logs from guard duty about log activity through CloudTrail, aggregated in Security Hub. How's that whole notification process going to work? So it becomes more of a people and a process challenge at that point. So these are all the things that aren't done for you by Control Tower. And they're all specific to an organization's very specific security and compliance requirements, which are different for every business that we work with. So it's really a case of helping. This is where we kind of get involved to help customers figure out and go on that journey to fine tune these environments to their specific use cases. So with that being said, that's me. I'm wrapped up. Hopefully that was useful and you learned a thing or two. So what I can do now is finish the presentation, open things up for any questions anyone might have. Got a few minutes, 10 minutes or so.
I had a question about your slides. You went through it pretty quickly and I wasn't able to get everything. Are you going to provide, that slide pack to Restart so that they can post it on our site so we can take a look at it at our leisure?
Yeah, I'll have a chat. I'm not sure what the process is. I'm sure we probably can. There's nothing that's not kind of public, and there's
Okay.
actually versions of this deck that are public and have been presented through things like reInvent and some of our so we can, at the very least, we'll be able to provide you with some links to YouTube recordings of some colleagues of mine who've delivered similar
Yeah.
presentations. And there's also
So there was.
sorry, I was just going to say also there is an events site on, I don't know what the link is, but there is an events site on our public website where you can actually find decks from lots of different presentations. I think a similar one is up there actually, but you can find slide decks that have been presented on hundreds of topics.
Great. Okay. Thank you. But we'll see what happens. You know, you going back to your reference architecture, you talked about, you know, log archive and security and shared services and network, and you know, you talked about all these different things, and those are something that you called landing zone, correct? That's what all that is known as together,
yes,
as the landing
correct.
zone.
Yes.
And you said you have a service that actually helps customers to create a landing zone like that called Control Tower, right?
Yes.
If you go back to that slide, do you think you could back up and take a look at that slide that had all of those different things like your log archive, your security, those different separate accounts? What I had a question about was, you know, I understand where you want to have all your logs centralized and separated from other accounts where you're doing things like production or like pre-production or like, you know, developers are acting. And then you had one account that was for network. So does that mean that within the network account, that's where you set up your VPCs?
No, yeah. So the network account's a bit of a tricky one. So so the networks would always be created within the workload accounts. So let's say you've got a production account that within which is deployed customers, public facing. Let's say it's a bank, right? And it's their
Right.
online banking service. Online banking service would be in the production account. All of the networking, all the VPC and the EC2 instances and all the databases would be running in that account. The networking account will be an account through which networking users are able to access those other accounts to do some configuration. And it may be where, depending on the network architecture, there may be some networking deployed in there. So quite often in enterprise, not very often, it's more likely the rule rather than the exception. For enterprise customers, they have a hub and spoke network.
Right.
So that hub is typically these days using an AWS transit gateway, which is effectively a kind of routing service, but it lets you connect many different VPCs together and then control the flow of traffic between them. So you can allow or disallow traffic between VPCs and from those VPCs to on-premise and from those VPCs to the internet. And it allows you to deploy inspection services. You could have appliances in there doing kind of intrusion detection, scanning, and basic IP filtering. So those kinds of things may be deployed within the networking account. And what you can do is you can use another service. I don't want to confuse you, but there's a service called the Resource Access Manager, RAM, and that lets users share certain resources between accounts. So I could have a network account and I could have the hub network VPC with the transit gateway defined, and I control that within the network account. And then I could share that to all of my other accounts so that they can attach their VPCs to the transit gateway, but they can't control what the routing rules do. That's in the network account. So as a network engineer, I can control which VPCs can get through that transit gateway and then out to somewhere else.
Right. So now, yeah, that makes sense because I couldn't quite figure out how how they do the networking, separate like that. But the way you explained it, it makes sense, and I'll look into that. Another thing that you talked about was developer accounts, and you showed it. It was down on the left-hand side, and it was separate. Now that developer account where they do the experimentation and it's an innovation space, I guess is the term that you used.
Mm-hmm.
Is that doesn't share all, like security, they're not logging anything to that. They don't have to go through security to do that or services. That's all just kind of separate, correct?
Oh, you'd still have, they would still be logging to the log archive account, but in terms of security, it really does depend on the risk appetite of an organization. So, for example, AWS is very hot on security. I have what would be termed a developer sandbox account obviously as a solution architect. We all have those. So they would be classed as sandbox accounts, but there's a lot of security process that goes around. There is a lot of scanning that goes on in those accounts. So it really depends on the kind of risk appetite of the customer. I would recommend, and the reason we do that is because if we are, I mean, we're not supposed to, there's policies and procedures in place so that we are certainly not supposed to put any kind of confidential data in those sandbox accounts. But it's not impossible for me or any customer, someone who's using one of these. Let's say there's a bank, right? And you've got a bank, you've given someone a developer sandbox account. Somebody could inadvertently upload some data that is confidential into an S3 bucket and make it public. So we have within AWS, we have processes and procedures and tooling and alerting in place to prevent that. Essentially, I can't do it. We've got guardrails in place to prevent us from making S3 buckets public in our sandbox accounts. We have to open a ticket and go through exception. There's a whole big process we have to go through to undo that. So yeah, there are probably security controls you should put onto those sandbox accounts. But yeah, that wasn't called out in the on the slide, but it's certainly something that we do, and it's probably something everyone should do, right, to make sure that inadvertent sensitive data isn't inadvertently leaked.
Great. Okay. Well, thank you very much. You did a great job with your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. Glad you found it useful. Any other questions before we wrap up? Okay, I will take that as a no. I shall follow up with the team to see if what we can share, and certainly I'll try and get some of these links out to everybody.
Sorry, this is Timmy. I just wanted to say that a lot of us did say in the chat that we were barely able to hear you. This is just a comment. If you look at the chat, you'll see that. So, I mean, there's a lot of good information was passed on, but we didn't hear it clearly.
Sorry about that. When I'm in presenter mode, I can no longer see the chime window, so I couldn't see anyone's comments once I was in flight. But yeah, what I can do is we can see if we can share some of the links to the to other similar resources and similar presentations that have been made and which are online, which might be of use to you. So yeah, I'll have a chat with the Restart team to see how we can get that out to everybody. I assume you all registered, so we'll have all your details, your email addresses for this.
Yes.
Yeah, cool. Okay, so we'll have your email address. So I'll have a chat with the organisers of this the webinar and see what we can get out to you.
Thank you.
Yeah, James, this is Raj. I'm one of the organizers here. So I have recorded this webinar. So this webinar recording will be put in the Canvas where the learners can get access to. So that could be one place where they can actually go back and revisit your video just to see if they've missed anything. So that could be one of the ways to get hold of that information. And yeah, you can just provide me the PDF version of your PPT slides. I can actually try to share it with the learners so they have access to that as well.
Cool. Okay. Yeah, I'll do that.
Yeah. Thanks, James.
Awesome. All right. Last shout for questions. Okay. All right then. Well, all right. Thank you very much, everybody, for joining and attending. I hope that was useful. Apologies again for the audio issues. But yeah, I hope you all have a good weekend.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, James.
Thank you. Cheers.